So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War, and to the second of the 3 replays that I'm having to do in quick succession so that I can try to get back up onto the current build that the testers are working on, so that if any new Silmarillion replays come in, I'll actually be in a position to do them. And this one is going to be a scenario by Eclipse 2500 the Dark Cloud, going to be nestled in between the two battles based upon historical events that Belagost has been making. This is going to be more of a classic scenario that has been made by Eclipse, and this may very well be the last replay that I do in 2020, or at least the last pre-record that comes out in 2020, so I think it's kind of fitting that we end it with an Eclipse scenario, considering he has made quite a few over the course of 2020. And this one going to be Silmarillion, and it's going to be 3 armies of House Finarfin defending against 5 armies of the Falathrim. So we've got a bit of a kinslaying going on here at the NAROG Delta, which is the name of this particular map. And it's got all the hallmarks of one of Eclipse's maps, to be fair, in the fact that it is very much a siege type layout, but it's not too enclosed. There are choke points, but it's not too restrictive, and yeah, be interesting to see. Finarfin are the sort of faction which do very well in a situation like this. For the Falathrim, it's a little bit more debatable how good they are on the attack, to be fair. Some elements of their army are very good at it, other elements are quite poor at it, so you would say that in terms of factions, Finarfin have got the edge, but they are also the defenders and outmatched by 2 whole armies, which naturally will give an advantage to the attackers. You may also notice, before we get into the army compositions as well, that I have turned Reshade off. Actually, we are going to be running on what is effectively fairly close to maximum settings for Medieval 2, just without Reshade, because the problem with doing Silmarillion in particular with Reshade is the fact that the Technicolor aspects of it tend to make it far too bright, considering that Silmarillion's brightness setting can't actually be altered. I'm not sure what bug would cause that, but it is something which I have had to deal with. But actually, to be fair, I think that without Reshade, I think it's arguably better, because the amount of detail I can get by turning on some of the settings which Reshade would cause the game to crash on, such as shadows and the version 2 shader, I think it's worth it. Having said that, I will flick back to the old way of doing things if this proves to be unstable, but I think without reflections on the water, which does cause a lot of problems, I haven't deigned to turn that on. I think we should be fine, but that is something which can be spoken about in the future potentially. We shall go through the army compositions now, starting off with the Falathrim. I've got a real soft spot for the Falathrim. I'm not that great at playing as the Falathrim, to be brutally honest, but I do like their style, and I also like several of the units in their roster as well. I like the lore as well, and just the general feeling and aesthetic that the Falathrim bring to the table. But where they may struggle on the attack in a situation like this is bound up in their lighter units. They do depend quite a lot on the core of their army, or at least what provides their numbers, to be more lightweight or medium tier troops, rather than the heavy Noldor units, which are only really reserved for their upper echelon. So the Brythonbar units will probably struggle in a really grindy engagement, especially against a faction as solid as Finarfin. Having said that, the ranges of Brythonbar are still perfectly valid as archers go. Depending on what they decide to shoot at will determine how useful they actually are, of course. One thing that the Falathrim do have over Finarfin, in the sense that both of them are actually pretty good when the going gets grindy, albeit Finarfin are better in that regard, especially when they've got the higher tier troops that a siege like this will provide them. The Falathrim, however, have got the edge when it comes to javelins. They've got a greater variety of them, and more of them are armour piercing. The Marines of Brythonbar here are the sort of more standard unit. I believe they're swordsmen in melee. I don't think their projectiles are armour piercing, to be fair. I think as the lower tier troop, they bear quite a lot in common with the Swordsman of Talathan that are going to be across from them today. But a very good unit for softening up that Finarfin front line, which they will need to do. The medium tier line infantry unit that they have, or the medium armour line infantry units that the Falathrim have, are the Warriors of Eglarest. Pretty good when they're bulked up in numbers like this. Again, in this sort of situation, numbers are going to be what the Falathrim have to rely on to a certain extent. In terms of outright quality and positioning, Finarfin will have the edge given that the battle is laid out in the way that it is. But Warriors of Eglarest will still be able to put up a really good fight against most things that Finarfin will have on the front line. The Talathian units will actually probably outright lose if it's a pure one-on-one melee fight against the Eglarests, but the Nargothrond units will of course have the beating of them, which is probably what most of the army is going to be based around. Spear Host of Brythonbar are the cheapest unit of infantry that the Falathrim can field. Basic spears, their armour is relatively light. It's going to be the kind of battle where they struggle, to be honest with you, and they won't even be useful for their anti-cavalry utility in this case, because of course Finarfin do not have access to cavalry. And we also have the Mariners of Erendil, which are essentially the bulked up version of the Warriors of Eglorest. In front of them they have a whole raft of improvements, not just to their base stats, but also they've got a few things going for them, like a boost to morale, a minor one, but still that will help to keep these elves pointing in the right direction as they face down a terrifying Finarfin front line. And also they have a few other bonus damage types as well to stuff like elephants. That's not going to be terribly relevant here, of course, but they are a substantially stronger unit than the Warriors of Eglorest that are in front of them. The Nobles of Balar are usually the centrepiece to a Falathrim army, and I would suggest that they still are here, to be honest with you, because they can still be a bit of a problem for Finarfin. But of course this is one of the few matchups, arguably the only one outside of possibly Fingolfin as well, where the Nobles of Balar won't be able to lock down the front line and slowly grind the enemy down, because of course the House of Finarfin have got the Bridge Wards of Nargothrond, which are better at doing that because they have the extra reach that pikes provide them rather than just the two-handed spears that the Nobles of Balar have to work with. We've also got some Seafarers of Brithombar. They are another sort of light armoured Brithombar unit, but they carry those maces as well, which gives them that armour-piercing utility, which will be very useful. Having said that, there are a couple of issues with this unit, namely the fact that because they're lightly armoured, you don't really need a great deal of armour-piercing to counteract them, so very basic units can actually do a decent amount of damage to the Seafarers. You have to support them properly, and you have to pair them off against the right targets to make them worthwhile. They're not the sort of armour-piercing unit that are sort of all things to all men. They have got a very focused role, and if you don't use them for that role, they will not perform that well. And finally, we have the Orion Efferdune, which are the only multiple HP unit that the Falathrim have, but they are very, very tanky, very heavy spears, big shield value as well, so they will be able to keep things locked down on the front line for a long period of time. And we also have the general back here. So we'll go through the other Finarfin, or Falathrim armies, I should say, a little bit more quickly, because I would imagine most of them are going to be rolling with similar units. We have more Orion Efferdune for Tundra's Fox over here, alongside Mevins Day. Rangers of Brithombar. He's also got some Marksmen of Balar, so the heavier archer. They'll be much better in a skirmish fight. I think they're actually better than any of the Finarfin archers in a skirmish fight, actually, because while the Marksmen of Nargothrond have got the split shots, they don't have a lot of ammunition in them. So if it comes down to just a pure range slugfest, the Marksmen of Balar should be able to outperform anything Finarfin have, which is a little bit interesting considering the fact that they have to just sort of sit there and take the punishment. We shall see how useful those marksmen are. More of the mighty Nobles of Balar. We've got more of the Warriors of Eglorest just in behind. More of the Seafarers with those armour-piercing maces. And finally at the back, possibly my favourite unit from the Falathrim, we have the Lim, a very expensive unit of heavily armoured Noldor infantry, but very, very strong, of course. Very, very capable of taking a lot of punishment and over time dishing out quite a lot of damage with those side swords that they wield as well. But how useful will they be against stuff like Wardens of Nargothrond, which can do a lot of armour-piercing chip damage over time with their spears? We shall have to wait and see, but they can outperform most of the rank and file very easily that Finarfin have. Whether they go into that Nargothrond front line or not will determine, I think, how useful they can actually be. Frodor Baggin has got several units of the Marines of Brithombar over here, some Rangers of Brithombar, Warriors of Eglorest, Spear Host of Brithombar just in behind here as well, and at the back 2 more units of Lim and 2 more units of Nobles of Balar. So they're not entirely weak armies, these Falathrim armies. They do have the heavy Noldor units in and amongst them, but it only makes up a small portion of their army. Most of it's going to be Brithombar and Eglorest units. J-Monster himself has got some Spear Host of Brithombar, he's got some Seafarers, some Marksmen of Balar just in behind. Up on top of this hill, some Warriors of Eglorest in with the Nobles of Balar, more Warriors of Eglorest, even more Warriors of Eglorest, and finally the Mariners of Erendil at the back as well. And that's going to be it for his army. And finally, 5th and final army, last but not least, we have Windy Pops. Nice to see him as well. He has got some Warriors of Eglorest on the front line. Yeah, very similar armies all around this. Spear Host of Brithombar just in behind, another unit of Orion Efferdune. We've got some Seafarers, some Marines of Eglorest. He's actually got some Foresters of Brithombar as well, which is quite interesting to see. They're a unit which can hide anywhere with a 2-handed spear. Very good at catching cavalry unawares, but in this kind of situation, in this kind of battle, they're probably the weakest unit Falathrim have, to be honest with you. They will do a little bit more damage than something like the Spear Host of Brithombar, but the lack of a shield means they're even more vulnerable in this kind of engagement. But still, extra numbers will never hurt. And some Lim as well. Now we shall move on to the mighty host of Nargothrond, the House of Finarfin. We've got Eclipse, who is going to be on the front. The Defenders of Talathin are a very basic unit that Finarfin use on the front line. Just a regular unit of spears, really, but of course mixed in with the other elements of Finarfin's defence, they can be a very effective unit indeed. Just in behind we have the Swordsman of Talathan, and very similar, like we said, to the Marines of Brithombar that we saw the Falathrim using, albeit with a little bit more of a focus around their armour and their defence, but for the most part they're much the same kind of unit. Javelins that are not armour-piercing, but still nice bit of punch that they deal before getting into melee like any other line infantry unit will. We've got some Wardens of Nargothrond back here again. While they may play second fiddle a little bit to the Bridge Wards in the usual Finarfin strategies, they're an incredibly important part of it, because they are really the higher tier unit that in melee are going to be dealing the damage. While they are spears and they are slowed down a little bit by that, the fact that they're armour piercing, as I've said in the past, is so important to a spear's ability to deal damage at these higher tiers, and the Wardens of Nargothrond are fantastic at doing that, and they will also be the main source of danger for some of the heavy Noldor units they'll be facing off against, so a very important unit for Finarfin in terms of the melee engagement. Swordsmen of Talathin, more Defenders of Talathin, more Wardens, lots of Talathin units in and around. And then back here, of course, I imagine all of the Finarfin armies, I should say, are going to be featuring these guys pretty heavily. The Bridge Wards, because they are going to be the best method for holding the line. Pikes, the best unit of pikes in the game, substantially. There is an argument for saying actually that the human pikes Fingolfin have are more efficient than the Bridge Wards, because the Bridge Wards are quite expensive, but in this kind of situation, in a scenario, that is completely unimportant. The quality is what matters, and the Bridge Wards have it in abundance. Marksmen of Nargothrond with their split shots obviously going to be very damaging, especially against the Brithombar units. Time will tell whether they get bogged down by something like the Marksmen of Balar. Got some scouts of Thorin Faroth, which I believe have got poison arrows. You don't see the scouts all that often because they do break from Finarfin tradition a little bit, in the sense that they're a little bit less about the upfront fight, and they sort of skulk around in the shadows, and they're a bit more lightly armoured than most of the Finarfin roster. But be interesting to see how they perform here. They're a two-handed spear, but again, cavalry is not going to be a factor in this battle. The Arqueni Mormagilwa are one of the very few units of Finarfin infantry that are actually outright aggressive, albeit they are a bodyguard tier unit, so generally speaking you'll still see them wrapped in cotton wool a little bit, but still a very damaging unit of two-handed swords. Very limited in number, but their stats are sky high. Bridge Wards, and I think that's pretty much it. I think we saw another unit of Arqueni actually over here. Indeed we did, 2 units of Arqueni for Eclipse, a couple more units of Bridge Wards, which I think he is going to retreat. And finally, well, I say that, there are 2 armies up here in the final stand. The Yoda guy, who has got more Bridge Wards, so plenty of pikes on display. Also a Catapult, obviously going to be very useful given the gradient, the topography of the territory, and obviously the damage that Catapults can do. Archers of Talathin are a very basic unit of archers. They'll outperform the Brithombar archers at range because of their bulkier nature, but they will have their ass handed to them on a platter, really, by the Marksmen of Balar. We shall see how they are used. More Marksmen of Nargothrond, more Swordsmen with those javelins, Defenders of Talathin for those spears, Wardens, Sartor Findarato, which we haven't seen up till this point, but this is the bodyguard spear, multiple HP, again pretty much the defensive bodyguard option for Finarfin, which fits more in line with what their faction is about as a whole, whereas the Arqueni back over here are more of an outlier, but you can see that Turin is there. He'll be here in, I don't know what the 3 version of Stereo is, but he's going to be there. Scouts of Thorin Faroth as well for Captain Gervais. He has got some Marksmen of Nargothrond, Archers of Talathin, and again Nargothrond units, very similar all around. Sartor Findarato, a second Catapult, Swordsman, Arqueni, and some more Swordsmen of Talathin as well. A very nice settlement. We shall see if going into Shader version 2 affects the reliability any. As without further ado, let's begin. Going to be quite an interesting one, this, I think, because there is there's a fair amount of quality, to be honest, in the Falathrim armies. While they do have a fair amount of these lighter Brithombar units, which Finarfin, if they play their cards right, will be able to deal with fairly easily, they have enough of their Noldor to the point where it's going to be on Finarfin, I think, to have to play well in order to win this fight. They're not just going to be able to sit there, organise their force into lines and watch as the Falathrim break upon them and then they easily romp to victory. I don't think that's going to be the case, even with all of their Bridge Wards back here in the settlement and all of their archers. I think how they use their artillery is going to be important, what they choose to target with their archers is going to be very important, and these, I think, are the factors by which this battle is going to be decided. yes, they'll be able to hold on for a long time on the front line, but I do think the Falathrim have got all the tools they need and the numbers they need to put the ball into Finarfin's court. It will be quite interesting to see, but I do quite like the Finarfin look. They've got quite an understated look by comparison with some of the other factions in Silmarillion. Certainly by the standards of Gondolin, who we haven't actually seen on my channel yet, but you should have seen them as J-Monster debuted them in one of his streams a little while back. Very, very ostentatious, some of their units, shall we say. But also factions like Feanor with their colours, and of course even the Falathrim with their light blues, their greys, more lurid blues as well. They're a little bit more vibrant than the slightly more muted tones of House Finarfin. But they have their own appeal as well, the Nargothrond elves, I must say. So he's going to be leading the way with his archers here as well, the Rangers of Brithombar. And I would do this as well, because there has to be some sort of response given to these Rangers of Brithombar. I mean, they will lose pretty much any skirmish fight they're put into. You know, even the basic archers of Talathi, they're more designed for going toe-to-toe with an enemy archer. The Rangers of Brithombar, significantly less so, but it will draw Finarfin into having to use some of their missiles. And I'm not sure whether Eclipse will want to do that immediately. You can see the Yoda guy is going to be moving down here, so they are going to make a play for holding on to this initial wider singular choke point with a little bit of gusto, which I like to see. I like the fact they're not just going to throw in the towel on the lower levels immediately. They are going to be setting up their units in position. Marksman of Nargothrond. I think if I were Finarfin, I would be waiting to use my Marksman of Nargothrond until later. If you can get like a side-swiping shot into the units of the Falathrim, then you're going to do an awful lot of damage. They may not be able to lay waste to units quite like a body-piercing projectile will, but it's the next best thing when it comes to dealing damage in bulk like that. The amount of ammunition is really the only thing that stops them from being a really rather monstrous unit indeed. And it means you can't afford to dither in range of Finarfin either. Once you get sort of in range of their archers, the clock is then ticking for you to have to engage their gnarly looking front line. So they're really a tough nut to crack, Finarfin. Maybe a little bit one-dimensional for some people, in the sense that how they are set up is a little bit more defensive. You can play them aggressively. Ooh, and they are actually going after the Rangers with the Marksman. I'm not sure I would have opened up with the Marksman straight away. You'll lay waste to the Rangers very quickly, but very limited amount of ammunition on these split shots. I'm not sure if I would have personally made that move. There you can see the laser-like projectiles as they streak forward, doing an awful lot of damage here to the Rangers. They're also going to move forward with a singular unit of Swordsman of Talathan and a bit of return fire from the Rangers as well. What are they actually firing at? I mean, they're not going to have much opportunity to fire any further. Yeah, indeed, Tundra's Fox has given that was a blank shot, so we'll never know. They were firing at something back over here, I assume. I guess they were firing at the bridge wards, and they managed to hit a couple of Talathian units in for the deal. Yeah, I mean, these Rangers, I would actually be quite happy with this, like I said, as the Falathrim, though. Like I said, the amount of value you're actually going to get with the Rangers of Brithombar against a prepared Finarfin front line. Finarfin and Falathrim are rather similar on the tongue. It's going to be limited. So if you can chew up a little bit of that very dangerous split-shot ammunition, you're in for a good time, I think. Or at least you're making it so some of your units later on are going to be less open to that sort of punishment. Got an opportunity here to shoot into the back of the Swordsman of Talathan, and they are going to take it. As the shields are now pointing the wrong way, you're going to be able to get a bit more damage done to them. And while they may be a very basic unit, every elf lost for Finarfin is going to be a tragedy in the making. The Falathrim here have got plenty more to be working with, as the main body of several of these armies is now moving forward. Tundra was a little bit closer than the others, but now he is going to receive a little bit of extra support. Windy is coming in here with his warriors, shields up front. J-Monster going to be also moving in here as well. The time will come, however, when they just have to bite the bullet, really, and just charge into an engagement with Finarfin, which is something relatively few factions in the game will enjoy. But they don't have enough archer ammunition to just sort of slowly wear them down campaign style and then move in with limited casualties. They're going to have to take the bull by the horns at some stage. course, Finarfin very nicely organised. We've got the ability to go through this little square here in the middle with this rather nice little shrine. So they can reinforce all sections of the line. If they couldn't go through this area, then I would say the middle would probably be the best place to attack, because reinforcements would be not as forthcoming in that region. You can see here the Rangers of Brythonbar getting a little bit closer, and now forward come the Swordsman of Talathan. Are they just going to try and get into melee? They're going to move backwards here, so a bit of a game of cat and mouse so far. You can see the attackers are going to try and draw the defenders out of position. Try and get one of their units to break ranks. I think the shields have mostly turned around by the time this volley has come in, so it's not going to be quite as damaging. Indeed, not many of these swordsmen are falling. A couple of the elves from House Finarfin falling. These rangers, though, are being allowed to fire relatively unopposed, and they are going after the most dangerous unit, or at least the unit that they have to try and puzzle their way past in the bridge wards. They're very heavily armoured, the Nargothrond units, but they are unshielded, and these are elven arrows that they're taking. I don't think that you can really afford to be too greedy with your ammo supply. Like I said, I wouldn't be using the marksman ammunition, but I would be using the archers. Just one unit of Archers of Talathan would be enough to give these Rangers of Brythonbar enough to think about, I think. Just to know that they can have it all their own way. Marksman of Nargothrond from Captain Gervais now firing in, and he actually has a good opportunity to shoot into the main body of the armies as they move forward over here. Windy and J-Monster taking a bit of damage. Marines of Eglarest, actually, I missed these in the composition phase. They're the Javelin variant, the mid-tier Javelin. They are spears in melee, so when it comes down to brass tacks in melee, they may not be quite as useful as their warrior brethren. Their javelins are better than the Brythonbar Marines, but they're getting focused down here by the Marksman of Nargothrond, perhaps seeing the javelins as the main threat to a Nargothrond front line. But that's enough for J-Monster to think, had enough of this, I'm not going to allow you to just sort of sit here and skirmish and pick and choose your targets against us. We're charging into melee. The spear hosts are going to take it on the chin. They're going to be sort of the sacrificial lambs to the slaughter, and then they're going to follow this up with a charge from the Seafarers of Brythonbar as well. The armour piercing will crack through the mail armour the Swordsman of Talathan are working with. Still though, there you can see the split shots streaking overhead, but I like this. The javelins are raining down from on high. J-Monster is moving in. I will say, actually, caught a little bit flat-footed over here were Tundra's Fox and Mevern. Like, when your ally is moving in, I think a unified assault on all fronts would have been slightly better than allowing one of your armies to get a little bit further ahead, lurching in front of the other. But it's not too much of a delay, so it's not going to have too much of an impact, I don't believe. And also over here, actually, the initial assault is going to be mounted by stronger units than on the other side anyway. Warriors of Eglarest going into the defenders of Talathan, which is a fight that the Falathrim elves will be all too happy to see. And there you can see Catapult being targeted down by fire ammunition from the marksmen of Balar. So they're hoping to, and they have as well, they have absolutely torn through this artillery crew, and that is a big loss for Captain Gervais, pushing his catapult a little bit too close to the fire, and he's ended up losing it, that's a big loss, honestly, for the defenders. That is a very key tag there from J-Monster. As many losses as he may take on the front line, this could end up getting pretty ugly for Finarfin pretty quickly if they don't have the power that those artillery pieces offer them, and a very big assault. Finarfin are going to need to get some reinforcements onto this front line if they intend to keep it, as the Falathrim are now being very aggressive, with Warriors of Eglarest leading the way over here, and some Brythonbar units also moving in, some Foresters just to help shore things up. More Foresters arriving on every section of the line from Mevern to support Tundra's initial push. Over here, the infantry fight not going quite as well, but I mean, it's odd. Over here, the Falathrim units that were committed initially were weaker, and over there, they were stronger, and it's the opposite for Finarfin. Over there, it was Talathan units. Over here, there was more Nargothrond units on the front line directly. So you would expect Finarfin to be having a better time of it over here, and indeed they are. Defenders of Talathan going off against the Warriors of Eglarest, who are getting shot from on high. The support that this Finarfin front line is going to get is going to be absolutely vital to see how long it's going to actually remain in business for. But Javelins coming in there, getting some good hits on the bridge wards. That is not good news for House Finarfin. The bridge wards need to be kept clear of ranged attacks as much as they possibly can, but I really like how aggressive the Falathrim are being here. They know if they linger, a lot of their more lightly armoured units are going to suffer for it. So if they're going to suffer, it may as well be in melee, doing damage to Finarfin and slowly eroding their chances at outlasting their very aggressive assault. Swordsman of Talathan having to deal with some freshly arrived warriors from Windy's army. More units arriving. There's more Falathrim elves being committed to this front line all the time. You can see the difference in thickness between the two front lines. Finarfin won't be... I mean, they perhaps should be a little bit concerned. In several areas they are slowly breaking through. I mean, to be fair, Rangers of Brythonbar in melee foresters, not the sort of thing which is going to keep this area locked down for too long, but I think they are following forward as well. Yeah, Erendil are now also arriving, which is a bad sign. As soon as they start getting in and amongst units like this, they're going to tear their way through Archers of Talathan. So it's actually panic stations for Finarfin. I'm not sure whether they were quite ready for an assault that was this aggressive. Tundra getting in behind enemy lines with his Erendil, Marines of Brythonbar trying to get to the side where they can shoot along the line, but it's easier said than done. But I wouldn't worry too much. These defenders of Talathan, and while they're good at holding the line, they're about to get sandwiched between the Eglarest units and the Erendil. Having said that, with those javelins there, the Erendil might have to continue to push through. Marines of Brythonbar finding a gap though. And so far, so good. For all of the time they had to prepare their lines, Finarfin have been found wanting in several locations so far. But, in typical Finarfin fashion, many factions I think in the face of this kind of assault would have already fallen apart completely and had to retreat back to the two secondary choke points further up the hill. That's not been the case with Finarfin. They have been able to dig their heels in and last longer. They will eventually, of course, be broken. But they have committed some strong units as well. I don't think they can really afford to let this choke point go too easily. With Sator Findarato down here, with a lot of bridge wards on the front line, fair few Nargothrond units, marksmen that are out of ammunition very quickly. It's questionable as to whether those marksmen really got enough kills. There's a lot of dead bodies back there, but maybe not to the density that you really need to be seeing if you're a defender in this situation. The Marksman of Nargothrond's ammo supply is such that you really need to be quite careful with them. Orion Efferdune moving forward as well. It's a real sign of intent here from the Falathrim that they have been so aggressive, going so far as to commit their most elite units early on. And I keep saying this is something which very few players, especially on the newer end of the spectrum, they rarely want to do this. They want to save their elites for late on, for like the final stand, so they can be the heroes. It's not necessarily what you need to be doing. If you commit them earlier, you force your opponent into either committing theirs or ultimately losing the fight because of that quality injection that you have. And with 5 armies to play with, someone can keep their elites back for later. But if everyone else piles them forward early, and the defenders are unprepared, or at least unprepared to the extent that Finarfin seem to be here, it can end up working very nicely for you. J-Monster's army starting to become a little bit shaken here, so Finarfin actually winning on this front line. The bridge wards managing to stabilise things, but the Falathrim also pushing up round the flanks. Some of the Marines of Brythonbar able to push through. So as long as they can keep fighting on that front line for a little bit longer, they will be able to work up the line over here as well. So it's a bit of a desperate attempt here for Finarfin to try and hold on to the territory that they have. But of course eventually the Falathrim will get through. Time will tell whether the more lightly armoured nature of a lot of these units that have been this aggressive, the Brythonbars and the Eglarest units, will that prove to be the hidden factor in this battle as we go forward? Will it turn out in the late game that the Falathrim just don't have the manpower to follow through against Finarfin? Because that will be the way that Finarfin end up winning this fight if they do at this point, I think, given the fact that, you know, the Falathrim seize the initiative really very nicely. Foresters the Brythonbar back over here. They didn't allow the Marines to get into a position to fire their payload of javelins, which is nice, but they're more than capable of defending themselves in melee with those swords and shields. Especially if it's against basically their sister unit from their opposing faction here in the Swordsman. Swordsman I would say are slightly better than the Marines, but I mean the difference between the two is fairly negligible. And here you can see, I mean, a lot of these units at this point in the front line are shaken, so they have been ridden pretty hard at this point, and Finarfin standing firm so far. Going to need a little bit more in the front line here in the middle, I think, where the Wardens of Nargothrond and some supporting bridge wards. Both sides are actually shaken, interestingly enough. Both sides are thinking of running, which is rather intriguing, is it not? Defenders of Talathin coming down, trying to stop the fact that the Falathrim were looking to wrap up the line over here, and they will be able to stop the progress of the Marines of Brythonbar and the Warriors of Eglarest. In fact, the Warriors, only 18 of them remain. They are wavering. Defenders of Talathin, and there are the poison arrows, and they've got into a good position, actually, the scouts of Tauren far off. Poison arrows actually could be a bit of a difference maker with a lot of the Falathrim front line, or at least individual units thinking of routing. Could it be? Could that be a crucial blow that's delivered? To be fair though, they are over there. None of the units over here are really... None of the critical units over here are looking like routing. It was elsewhere on the line where the poison arrows perhaps would have been at their most useful. Some Rangers of Brythonbar are going to be trying to shoot into the back lines of the Finarfin units over here that were trying to salvage this line. They have done it to a large extent. I do think that the Falathrim need to commit forward more infantry if they are able. Some Seafarers of Brythonbar may be pushing in over to this section of line where they're looking a bit thin on the ground. Finarfin, because if they leave it without reinforcements, all of the good work that the Falathrim have done could be undone. Losing your bottle halfway through a really aggressive push could be a real issue. And I mean, it's not as if you need to worry too much about reinforcements. You have enough left in the tank, I think. The last thing you need is to be losing. And over here, to be fair, they are committing forward more units. Frodor Baggin committing forward a unit of Nobles of Balar. Very, very nice. And with the depletion of the bridge wards, the Nobles of Balar will sort of retake their normal role as being the dominant anchor on the front line. Our Queni Mormagilwa are pulling back, 25 of them, so they've taken a few losses, but not too many. You can see at this point Finarfin realise their days are numbered with the fact that the Balar units are being committed forward, and the fact that some Seafarers of Brythonbar have broken through into the back lines, these Macemen. I don't think they're going to be able to save much of anything over here. Maybe they could save those Sator Finderato. If they're going to, they should do it right now. And you can actually see that's what they're going to do. I think the Yoda guy was told to do that, but I'm not sure whether they're going to make it here as the Seafarers of Brythonbar look to cut them off. I think they're going to make it. I mean, even if the Seafarers do tag them, I think the Sator Finderato can force path their way through, and yeah, they will. So, close there. Could have been a good tag, that, from the Falathrim, but now the Seafarers of Brythonbar are going to sandwich in these Talathi units, finish them off very efficiently. As the Elves of the Falas move forwards. Nobles of Balar, I think. Yeah, Defenders of Talathin over here. And Swordsmen sort of held up on this very depleted unit of Marines, and as a result, this unit of Defenders of Talathin is going to have to be left behind, you would have thought. And indeed, these Swordsmen may also be left behind if these Warriors of Eglarest get into a nice position. They are going to charge into the side there. So yeah, these Talathin units are going to be dealt with. Good opportunity perhaps for some of these archers to start shooting into something like the Nobles of Balar. They're very heavily armoured. It's much the same story as it is with the bridge wards. The lack of a shield does make them somewhat vulnerable to missiles, but they have very high armour values, so you're not going to drop them really quickly with basic archers. And the poison arrows, of course, don't mean that they do any extra damage as such. Seafarers getting into the rear lines as well, being able to utilise those maces, cracking through the well-made Nargothrond armour. And there's also Marksmen of Balar, who presumably have used up their ammunition, pulling out their two-handed large elven curved blades, as is the custom for many high-tier, heavy elven archers. These marksmen still have their bows. And there you can see the split-shot projectiles being used once again, but not to any hugely significant effect. It says a lot about the Finarfin morale as well, the fact that they're continuing to fight. 51 of them, they may be shaken, surrounded on all sides, but they're still refusing to break. Admirable, to say the least. Orion Efferdune, who have been fighting for a little while, to be fair. They've taken a bit of damage, to be sure, but they must have been a calming presence on the front line for the Falathrim alongside the Aran Kialim, the big guns moving forward to try and dismantle the Finarfin front line, and they were successful overall, I would say. The high level of aggression served them pretty well, I think, there for the Falathrim. So this leaves a puzzle for Finarfin to try and solve. They still have some good units. Scouts of Torin Faroth can shoot. They've still got Wardens on the front line. They've still got a good amount of bridge wards, so they've got the ability to hold on to these choke points, and these are narrow, but there are now two of them. Do Finarfin have enough left in the tank to be able to adequately hold on to two separate choke points? Do the Falathrim have enough left in the tank to attack two separate choke points? They certainly can't afford to just limit themselves to one, otherwise Finarfin can use their full might in a narrow choke point, which is never what you want to allow them to do. They do still have this catapult as well, and with the depletion of the Falathrim missiles, that catapult should be a little more useful, you would assume. Very good tag that though was by Jaemont, so like I said, to be able to demolish them with the fire arrows as quickly as they were, very, very important, because they could have done a lot of damage to the Falathrim front line, which was ultimately avoided thanks to the quick and decisive use of that ammunition. Poison arrows being shot into the Seafarers and Warriors of Eglarest as they move forward, preparing another assault. They probably shouldn't get too far ahead of themselves. They need to wait. If they go into melee as they are, they will be turned back incredibly quickly. It'll be a bit of a waste, I think, to just send these Seafarers in all on their lonesome. They're not going to be able to do much of anything here. I mean, the AP of the Wardens won't really be coming into effect, but their huge defensive values will. Of course, the support of the bridge wards means that these Seafarers are not really going to make much of a dent at all. Oh, and it was Windy, actually, that sent his units ahead of schedule. But they are going to move forward quickly, which I do like. They're going to try and keep that momentum. Crashing upon the Finarfin front line like waves. Marines of Brathambar on the front line over here. Pretty similar story over here, actually, in the sense they've sent some initial probing attacks forward. Over here, though, it's perhaps a little bit more understandable as to why they would be a little bit more leery of sending forward a full force, because, of course, that catapult is there. So they're pretty much reduced to having to slowly wear Finarfin down. And that is something relatively few factions are going to be good at, and especially with the basic Brathambar units they'll struggle. Whereas over here, they've got a little bit more of a free pass to go in all guns blazing, really, because while they will be shot in the side by the scouts of Tor and Faroth, that is much less of a dangerous proposition than the catapult is. The Marksman of Nargothrond, however, could be exactly what the Doctor ordered for Finarfin over here, and of course on the front line, the dream team is at it again, the Wardens of Nargothrond and the Bridge Wards of Nargothrond. A mighty duo indeed, but you know, the Falathrim here able to weasel their way through the middle of this line, finding a gap between the two blocks of infantry. They will probably end up routing here, and indeed they do, but there is a hole here to be taken advantage of. They could potentially still do so before the Swordsmen of Talathan are able to get in there and plug that gap. Will they have the speed to do that? They're taking a lot of damage as well. Those Nobles of Balar able to withstand a lot of punishment because of their armour, but still. Warriors of Eglarest trying to push their way through, but they don't manage to get there in time. And in the end, Swordsmen of Talathan do end up plugging that gap. Still the weakest part of the line, though, you'd have to say. It's a more enticing prospect to fight the Swordsmen and Archers of Talathan than it is the Nargothrond duo. We shall see. The catapult here will be just as useful, really, as a deterrent as much as its ability to deal actual damage. Because it just, like I said, it just means they can't afford to send forward loads and loads of units. They're doing the right thing here. This is the right amount, I think, of quality. You can see there the Aran Lim taking a full volley there from the Marksman of Nargothrond, but not a lot of damage. I mean, probably the worst unit you could use the Marksman of Nargothrond on, to be honest with you. A frontal assault on the heavily armoured and shielded Aran Lim with your limited ammunition. I mean, it looks impressive, and you will kill some of them, but it won't be the efficiency that you really need from a unit like the Nargothrond Marksman. The Catapult going to try and get into position now. Nobles of Balar are on the front line, which, to be fair, it's only Wardens of Nargothrond on the front here, so the Nobles of Balar should be pretty good here. But of course the Bridge Wards move forward in response to that. You can see trying to push through to try and get to the Catapult of the Aran Lim. They'll need a little bit of support if they're going to be able to do that. The Orion Efferdune as well, probably an even worse target for the Marksman of Nargothrond. They might not have their multiple HP anymore, but the armour and shield values are even higher on them. You could try and assassinate their general, I suppose. Meanwhile, over here you can see they have very much solidified their front line at this point, have House Finarfin. But Marksman of Nargothrond running out of ammunition, not too surprising. The Scouts have a little bit more ammunition, but they have very long spears they have. They're a two-handed spear though, they're not like a pike or anything like that. Warriors of Eglarest getting shot in the back as well, so none of the shield values are coming into effect either, so anything that is not a heavily armoured Noldor infantryman is going to be punished here by the Scouts. We shall see if it's enough. There's also a unit over here ready to move in when needed, a full unit of Arqueni Morma Gilwa, which they will be really good against the light and medium units that Finarfin, or the Falathrim I should say, bring to the table. Lack of AP means the higher tier Noldor stuff will put up a much better fight against them, but even so, the high damage of them. They had to push the Catapult out of there as well. They've really made it quite a long way, the Aran Lim. They will probably pay for it quite dearly by routing eventually. But at the very least, they pushed the Catapult off of its nice, cosy spot to the side of this line. And this is allowing the Falathrim the time needed to do a bit of extra damage here to the Nargothrond units. It says that Finarfin are still favourites to win this particular bout, but they have the opportunity here, the Falathrim. If I were them, I would actually try and take this opportunity, or I would have tried to take the opportunity to move forward a bit more, but I think they may have left it just a little too long, because the Catapult can still turn around and perhaps panic shoot into this line. That may be enough, and the Erendil are broken and fighting to the death. There's less over here as well. They are really going to be dependent on that Catapult, I think, to actually hold on to this front line over here, because if they don't use it well, I don't think they have the numbers or the quality really over here. I mean, the Sator Finderato are very strong, the bridge wards are good, but still fairly reliant on like Talathi and units now of ammo archers, which eventually is going to prove to be their undoing if they can't use that Catapult. I think Scouts still teeing off into the Elven front line, and even the Nobles of Balar are shaken here, so the Poison Arrows are doing their thing. Scouts of Tor and Faroth that are out of ammunition being added to the front line now as well, just committing everything, trying to stop the Falathrim in their tracks. The momentum, the sting of their advance has gone. At this point, if they're going to win, it won't be through blitzkrieg, but through slow and methodical wearing down of their enemy. And it is a very even fight. This is the kind of battle, however, that Finarfin do so enjoy being a part of. Still some Seafarers back there, so a bit of AP punch that could be added to the front line, some Javelins being utilised. I mean, they've got a clear enough shot into the marksman that they may as well take it. And once they're out of ammunition, of course, they can then be guilt-free applied to the front line. A few of the marksmen do fall by the wayside there. Another unit of Scouts over there. Yeah, even over here, I mean, they do have a few units in the backup. There goes one of the... He was over here somewhere. One of the attacking generals. That could have been conceivably a few. Doesn't really matter, I suppose, which general falls first. Meanwhile, the Catapult begins to open up, grilling some of these Rangers of Brithombar by the looks of things. They're not going to move forward with their Orion Efferdune, as was their original intent as a result, but look at this, they've still got Balar units back here. He's not using Flaming Shot, the Yoda guy, which is very surprising. He should be using Flaming Shot. Regular shot just doesn't have quite the same level of splash damage, and you need as much splash damage as you can, especially when the Rangers are a little bit spread out like this. If you're going to go after the Rangers as well, I mean, I would question going after this target anyway. I think you've got bigger fish to fry, and speaking of which, there's another unit of Nobles of Balar that are on the way forward. A dangerous unit, because there are still more of these guys to commit, whereas the bridge wards have mostly already been committed to the front line for a little while. The last thing Finarfin need is for their own greatest weapon, the Phalanx, to turn against them in this fight, because as soon as that happens, they're not really going to be able to win. Like, they will be outnumbered, but they can still win fights based on their dominance in this kind of engagement. But if they lose that, I would say that it's curtains for them, really. Meanwhile, these Scouts still have ammo. I guess he did have 3 units of them, so he could have been rotating them quite nicely. Still a lot of bridge wards on this front line over here, and to be fair, over on this side of things, while things don't seem to be going too well on the other side, over here, the Falathrim do seem to have run up against a bit of a brick wall, or steel wall, I should say, as the Nargothrond units have been able to stand firm in the face of this consistent assault. And he still has a bit of reinforcements as well that they can use, including another unit of bridge wards that have been kept back in reserve. There's still a lot to be committed back here as we have a look at the Falathrim's reinforcements. Less than on the other side, to be fair, but they still have a block of Nobles of Balar, some Erendil, yeah, all of Frodor's Noldor units can still be moved forward, some Seafarers of Brithombar as well. There's also some Orion Efferdune as well, so yeah, they have enough reinforcements over here to keep this assault up. Windy, I think, sees the necessity of actually sending forward another unit, and he has sent forward his Erendil, which will stand and fight for a long time, but won't necessarily be the X factor that they need. They need to get another unit into the middle here, otherwise they could end up getting compartmentalised. Yeah, just a unit of Marksmen of Balar would be good enough to do that. The Catapult continues to fire. No, it's done damage, but I think, you know, you could have been so much more effective if you were using Flaming Shot. Range the Brythonbar trying to squeeze around the side. I mean, this is good. If this was a unit of, like, dedicated infantry rather than out-of-ammo light archers, this could be enough to really swing the battle in the favour of the Falathrim here, but the fact that they chose to do it with a unit that's that comparatively weak in melee means that they will probably end up just getting forced back into the standard line battle now that the Swordsman of Talathan and the Sator Finderato have moved forward to stop their advance. And we have here a Catapult. Rangers of Brythonbar continuing to fire. Victory is almost a certainty. The Catapult gets ready to fire once again. More Spear Host of, well, I say more, some Spear Host of Brythonbar moving forward. Again, the least threatening of all of the Falathrim units in terms of the damage they can deal in melee, but it's just the fact that more and more infantry is coming forward. And there's only so much pressure that Finarfin can take. Even they have their breaking point, and I do wonder when that is going to be, if we shall see it. It would be the ultimate expression of their strength, really, if they were able to just outright hold on to these front lines for as long as it takes. Swordsman of Talathan in taking a bit of a savaging. Combination of Marksmen of Balar and Foresters of Brythonbar going at them in melee. Erendil and Nobles of Balar shuffling forwards as well. Some of Frodor's Noldor units. Could that be another throw of the dice to try and snap this Finarfin resistance in two? We shall have to wait and see. Finarfin seem to be doing better on the other side than they are on this side, though, because while consistently they have actually been winning on this front line, they are getting slowly pushed backwards. And the Falathrim do seem to be gaining ground, gaining yardage up the hill. And of course, if the Falathrim are allowed to sort of surge forward and spill out over into this open area at the top of the hill, then it will be all over. Finarfin's greatest strength is their ability to keep their opponents bottled up. Catapult, you can see they're trying to go after that Catapult. Spear Host of Brythonbar trying to push through. There may be spears, and spears are pretty good at pushing through, but they are fairly lightweight. This also has the secondary effect, really, of crippling the formation of the bridge wards. A few of the Spear Hosts here, of course. The artillery crews in Silmarillion are more than capable of looking after themselves. They are essentially defenders of Talathi and in melee, so they're not defenceless in the way that artillery crews can be in other mods. But just the fact that you're interrupting the Catapult from firing here is very, very key, and you can see that the Falathrim here are trying to push through. There's some Rangers in there, some Spear Host of Brythonbar. Very basic units, but they're using what attributes they can, their mass, to try and jumble up this Finarfin formation, and then I would assume, yeah, there's some Nobles of Balar moving forward, and there's already some on the front line, so as soon as the Finarfin front line has been sort of messed up a little bit, the Falathrim can then get their own phalanx into place that's more organised, and they can presumably try and turn back the Finarfin front line. Over here, meanwhile, you can see they were trying to do the same thing. The middle part of the line, where it was looking a bit thin on the ground, they have renewed their efforts here in the middle. Marksmen of Balar, Nobles of Balar, some Erendil are in there as well from Frodor Baggin, so his Noldor units, when they arrived on the front line, they have dramatically changed the shape of this engagement, you would have to say. Still bridge wards back there. I mean, he does have some scouts of Tor and Faroth that he can move in as well to sort of plug some holes. They're not exactly the most damaging unit in melee, though, against this kind of opposition. Very multifaceted unit, but will that be enough? I don't think it will. I think ultimately, for all of Finarfin's strengths on the front line, I think that savage assault at the start, where it caught them a bit flat-footed, they've never quite been able to feel as though they had it in the bag on the front lines. The Falathrim have always had more that they could commit forward, always had the ability to turn fights around, whereas I think Finarfin are going to run dry on that sooner. Some scouts of Tor and Faroth, you can see some archers in the background. Marksmen of Balar are there, a very depleted unit of Rangers of Brythombar. To be fair though, there's not a lot of reinforcements left to commit. Marksmen of Balar, Aran Lim. What is left back down here though is mostly strong units, Foresters maybe less so, but some Nobles of Balar, some Aran Lim, and perhaps with one last huff and a puff this house can be blown down. You never can tell though. I mean, this can turn around remarkably quickly. Like I said, if all of the light units of the Falathrim decide to give up the Ghost, and Finarfin can say that they were able to outlast this savage assault, it would pretty much be the ultimate expression of how strong Finarfin can be in this kind of engagement. Especially considering that the Falathrim, for all of their lighter units, when it comes down to brass tacks in melee, they are one of the factions which is going to be better at fighting Finarfin than most, because they have their own phalanx, they have javelins, they have a good mix of strengths which can be brought to bear against Finarfin. It's not as if it's a Syrian where, you know, they really struggle in this kind of engagement because they have a very limited capacity to put on a front line like this. But I think it's going to come down to numbers here. While the Falathrim have taken an awful lot of losses on this front line, the bodies are piling high all the time. The Arqueni Morma Gilwa were committed forward as well. Like I said, they should do. Our general just died right in here somewhere. You can't really see him because of how packed it is, but Windy's general did fall, I think. The Arqueni will do really well against the Brythombar units, but against the Noldor, against the Orion Efferdune, they will still take quite a long time to kill in high quantities. And they don't have the luxury of time here, I don't think, Finarfin. I think one of their last units of reinforcements, this unit of defenders of Talathi, is going to be committed as well, but is it going to be enough? Bridge wards, the mighty bridge wards being laid low. Let's see more Wardens of Nargothrond pushed forward onto the front line. Again, they will do quite well because of that little bit of AP bite they have against the Aran Lim. But the Aran Lim have actually shown themselves to be a very good vanguard unit in this battle. When the time came to be aggressive and on the front foot and try and push their way through, get right up into the faces of Finarfin, the Aran Lim were there. And the key was just back them up. They won't be able to work miracles on their own, a high tier unit of light infantry like this, but I think the patterns that they used here, the attackers, the way they chose to engage Finarfin made it very difficult for Finarfin to get set, and by the time they did get set, the battle was already against them and they were facing an uphill struggle, and I don't think they're going to be able to make it to the top of that hill, unfortunately for them. Yeah, there's a gap here and you can see they're going to try and work up the line now. Nobles of Balar from Frodor Baggin going to be able to lock down the gains that they have made. Foresters of Brythombar and Seafarers of Brythombar from Windy as well. I think the last of his army really being committed forward at this point. They're just going to commit forward the full Monty of their units. I think he could have gotten away with sending another unit up around the flank, to be honest with you, but I guess it makes sure the line is thick enough to do the business. Eclipse's unit of Arqueni that he still had in reserve is going to be charging forward. They do get in and amongst the Nobles of Balar's formation, actually, which is pretty bad news for them, because those the Knights of the Black Sword will cleave their way through them, armour or no. But it's not going to be enough. Even if they do end up beating those Nobles of Balar, it will be a minor victory at best. They're cutting through them quickly, though. Goes to show how strong the Arqueni really are when they get going. A lot of base damage on them, and there's another unit of them over here as well, so there's plenty of them still here, still doing their thing. Probably the single scariest unit left on the field, to be honest with you. The Orion Efferdune are all well and good, but they're certainly more of a defensive beast than the Arqueni. Marksmen of Nargothrond also pulling out their big curved blades. Doing quite well over here, the Bridgewards of Nargothrond. They have stabilised to a certain extent over on this flank. The Odagai's Catapult crew having to muck in melee every Nargothrond elf is going to be necessary here. As you can see there, the flaming arrows absolutely tearing their way through these catapults. A viable way to deal with artillery now. No longer do you need to be entirely reliant on your own artillery, be it catapult or ballista, to counteract that. They were on about changing something in the game to make archers like this a little bit more well suited for bringing down artillery. So high tier archers with flaming ammunition are capable of doing this sort of thing now. But this is the first time I've actually seen it in action, and they've used it to devastating effect, I must say, the Falathrim, because the catapults really weren't up to the standard. One was destroyed really before it could land a single blow. The other one, the blows it did land were with standard shot rather than flaming shot. And it didn't land enough of them anyway to make too much of a difference. You can see here these nobles of Balar really being carved asunder by the Arqueni. They've killed off a few of them in return, but a very, very dominant engagement there, and all of a sudden, maybe a little bit too, getting a little bit too big for their boots. Rangers of Brythomba probably firing into the Arqueni. If they were to win this front line for Finarfin, like I said, they are so dominant in these kind of fights. They can just hold their ground so well. And a fair amount of the... well, there goes one of the generals. I think that was Eclipse's general. It goes to show they really don't know when they're beaten Finarfin. They will just dig their heels in. They may very well win on the other side, but I think over here they will lose, and then they will have to deal with a fight on two fronts. But it has been a bloody encounter. And fine margins, I have to say. There is not much in this at all. While I would say this is one of those battles where, ever since that really aggressive push, I think the Falathrim have had slightly the better end of this engagement. It's never been dominant, and I mean, it's still not beyond the realms of possibility if the pikes are pointing in the right direction and the Arqueni continue to do their thing. But I think some slightly depleted Orion Efferdune and some fully fresh Marksmen of Balar arriving in melee as well. You would think this is where the Arqueni's dominance comes to a juddering end. Very, very impressive performance from them, however. I think most people would count the Sons of Hurin to be the most impressive bodyguard tier shock infantry unit in the game as it stands, but you don't necessarily need armor piercing to be very, very effective at that sort of thing. If your base damage is high enough, you can still do the business, and the Arqueni are the ultimate expression of that. The Orion Efferdune are a pretty good expression of that as well. They've done it really quite nicely for themselves. Not many of the Nargothrond elves remain on the front line anymore. Still a little bit left to be committed as well. Rangers of Brythomba. There's still 74 Orion Efferdune, which I think is definitely the sign that the Falathrim are going to be victorious here, because they're fully fresh. And while Finarfin are putting on a good show of it, making a good fist of it on the front line, still this Arqueni Mormagilwa. The difference between merely a high tier unit and a bodyguard unit being demonstrated here is the Orion Efferdune getting carved apart by the Arqueni. This is also the difference, I would say, between a multiple HP unit and a single HP unit, which is part of the reason why I've never been sold on the idea of infantry single HP bodyguards, as I've mentioned before, with the Mythern and Tolgalen and the Sons of Ulfang. I just don't think they're up to snuff. In comparison to other examples, I would personally never use them as a bodyguard for my general. I would be just using them merely as high tier infantry units. And I think the Orion Efferdune actually are pretty similar in terms of cost to the Mythern and Tolgalen. They drop the AP but have a little bit more armour and a few more men in the unit, and that's about the only differences I can think of off the top of my head, but that's a matter for a different time, I think. From the outside perspective looking in, that would be my observations on the matter of single HP bodyguards. 31 Orion Efferdune pulling back off the front line. Yeah, it's a numbers game here. Maybe Windy did do the right thing by committing his Brythomba units to the front line just to make sure they have enough to keep this assault going. How many bridgeports do they have left? 11? That's not going to be enough. 25? 17 Arqueni, who have just been, again, against two of the three heavy Noldor units that the Falathrim have. The Arqueni showed themselves to be top dogs when it comes to dishing out the punishment. The remaining Mariners of Erendil, the Orion Efferdune, are now being committed to the front line. Those nobles have seen combat at some stage because they have taken losses. Yeah, Marksmen of Balar heading around to the back now, and with a rear charge from them, you would say that Finarfin, the conclusion of this battle is rapidly approaching. Catapult crew. Mariners have been here on the front line for a little bit as well, and they have the battle scars to show for it. Arqueni Mormagilwa. Getting caught out a little bit by the marksman Balar. They're going to try and move in here to plug the gap that had appeared, well, I say front line. It's not much of a front line anymore. It's basically a pocket of resistance. But they really showed what they were made of there, Finarfin. The initial engagement went noticeably in the Falathrim's favour, and they still made a good play of this. So this was without their catapults really performing to standard, as I said, if you bear that in mind. There was a few times as well where I would suggest their archers could have been used more efficiently as well, and I think those two things really the difference here. If those two things had not occurred, we could be sitting here looking at a Finarfin victory rather than an Elves of the Falas one. Nice to see the Falathrim effective in this situation though, it shows that they can be. I was a little bit worried that their light units would be committed forward first without elite support and they would have bounced off Finarfin unceremoniously. This is looking grim, and the NAROG Delta will fall into the hands of the Mariners. Again, even now, though, Finarfin continuing to just sort of fight to the bitter end. And there is still over 1,000 frames left, so it does go to show that even when they have definitely lost a battle, it will just continue. And over here, they have won over on this choke point at last, the arrival of those marksmen. The final nail in the coffin, but very depleted. Windy is still alive. I don't think J-Monster has anything left, interestingly enough. Frodor Baggin does, Thunderous Fox does, I think. His is the Falathrim army that has been completely destroyed without anything left, but then he was also the first to engage, so makes a certain amount of sense. Everyone else has something left, but it is to a very limited extent. And perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of what is left for the Falathrim is their heavy Noldor units, the units that you would expect to be more robust in this kind of engagement. Is that the... No, that's an Elven officer. I thought that might have been the last general for a second there. And there is Turin. He himself is in there. With each swing, he carves down a noble of Balar. That one actually managed to parry his blow. An impressive performance by the anti-hero himself. He's not going to be able to fight his way out of this one though. Two of the Arqueni left. His compatriot is over on the other side, getting skewered by Orion Efferdune. And there he is, continuing to now go after softer targets perhaps, and there he goes. I wouldn't say that. 6% the difference between elves. A marvellous fight indeed. And there we go, we can't actually tell who is who, and not that it really matters actually, because everyone on the attackers got a relatively similar outcome in terms of kills, and the same is true for those on the defence as well, so it goes to show that everyone was performing to a good standard, I think, and everyone was very much on a level playing field. Good scenario, I would say. Showcases how strong Finarfin are on the defence, but it also shows, bear in mind they are the best faction for this kind of combat. I think it goes to show a winning strategy perhaps that you can employ when you're on the attack, regardless of whether you're the Falathrim or not. I think that initial aggressive burst was something that Finarfin weren't quite ready for in that strength. I think they were maybe expecting a slightly more limited, a bit more of a softball perhaps in the initial assault, an easier first wave, but that was not what they ended up getting, and I think that was what set the tone really for the whole fight. But let's see what did the damage for the Finarfin armies. Arqueni Mormagilwa getting 458 goes to show that, you know, for such a small unit, they pack such a punch, especially when you're talking about the Falathrim who have got those lighter units in the mix. You know, they're going to be extremely good against them, but we also saw how dominant they were, to be fair, against the more heavily armoured Noldor as well. Marksman got a lot of kills actually, but I'm not sure how much of those were in melee and how much were at range. I would still suggest that based on what I saw of the Marksman, they were getting good kills, but when you're on the defence like this, you need your ranged units in particular to be so efficient, And I think they needed at least one of those Marksmen of Nargothrond to be shooting up the line, or at least one more, because I know that Eclipse had one of his units shooting up the line over on this side of the battle. Bridgewards, not a lot of kills actually between them, but of course that's not really what they're for. They're just there to hold the line and be the anchor. They can pick up a lot of kills over time, but on this occasion they were definitely reliant on other units to get the kills. Wardens of Nargothrond did okay as well. Again, they get their killing done relatively slowly, but the armour piercing means they're more than capable of it when it comes to facing off against the Noldor. Talathin in units relatively average. Sartor Finderato doing reasonably. This must have been Eclipse's army, I assume, with the scouts of Tor and Faroth, because they did okay. Archers as well, lots of units, many of them breaking 100, very few getting under. Only 46 for those Bridgewards. These Bridgewards actually got a higher kill count, which is interesting. 490 on those Wardens of Nargothrond is incredibly impressive. Slightly less for the Arqueni this time, but 291 is still a hugely impressive return for a unit of that size. And finally, none of this player's units breaking 400, but several of them breaking 300, including Marksman of Nargothrond. Arqueni, this must have been Eclipse actually, because he has 2 Arqueni units. Bridgewards, again, holding things down, none of them breaking 200 kills, but they're not supposed to, they're the anchor. And 312 on another unit of Marksman, so his Marksman did very, very well. I would assume that's because he was shooting up the line as well. So, I mean, to be fair, the Marksman of Nargothrond did a lot of heavy lifting. The Catapults, I guess, were a bit of a difference maker, because if we have a look to the Catapults, yeah, 45 on one, that's nowhere near enough, 113 on the other. But again, a lot of those could have come in melee, to be brutally honest, with that Yoda guy sort of making up a brick in the wall of that front line. And they would have, picked up a decent kill count for themselves in melee, more so than at range. So they didn't really land enough damage with their Catapults, certainly not with the flaming shot either, which would have made a nice difference, I would say. But yeah, big thank you to Eclipse for sending me this battle replay, and to what I think this one is going to be the last of 2020, like I said. So it's been an interesting year generally, I think, for most people. For my channel, however, it's been a little turbulent, I would say. Not so much in terms of the performance of the channel or anything like that, but more so behind the scenes. It's been the uncertainty just generally pervasive in the world today has also affected kind of my future planning with what my channel is going to be all about, and I'm still not entirely sure really what exactly is going to be happening as of recording this. I mean, it's starting to take shape, I would say, what's going to be happening. At least we've narrowed it down really to one of two things for sure. These two will affect the channel in potentially quite different ways, but I'm not really ready to talk about that yet until I actually know what's going to be happening for sure. Irregardless of that, though, thank you for sticking with me throughout 2020, and let's hope 2021 is a little bit more of a pleasant experience all around for the world, shall we? Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.